Hello and welcome to the first of a 4-part winter series of videos for Canon here on the WEX channel. My name is Raj K and this week I'm going to be taking you through the Canon camera range. We've picked out 3 different cameras for different budgets and different uses to go through to give you an idea of what we can offer. I'll also take you through a lot of the lenses and what to look for when shopping for lenses. Throughout the video I'll take you through some of the menus and give you some example imagery so you can see what I'm talking about. So to start off, let's look at the cameras. Canon have a huge range of products covering all budgets. So whether you want a small and light camera or something fast or high resolution, they have you covered. This video would be many hours long if we were to go through every camera. So we've picked 3. We've gone with the M6 Mark II, the 6D Mark II, and the brand new EOS R5. So we have 3 cameras from 3 different series. We have a mirrorless M mount body, we have a mirrorless R mount body, and we have a traditional DSLR with the EF mount. For this video, we have picked the M6 Mark II. Jesus! I nearly dropped it. Didn't drop it, it's fine. It's totally fine. So we'll start off with the M6 Mark II. This is my favourite camera within the M series lineup. It's really small, it's compact, and with some lenses it's basically pocketable. You have the option of a viewfinder which clips on the hot shoe there. The M6 has a 32.5 megapixel sensor, meaning you're going to get extremely high resolution images despite the small size of the camera. It can also do 4K video and 120 frames a second slow-mo in full HD. So if you want to capture those really fast action shots and slow it right down, you're able to do that with this camera. It's a superb camera with so much detail and excellent low light capabilities. In a small package, it packs in an articulating screen, a built-in flash, and a microphone port, so you're not left out when you're trying to do some video. It's worth noting that this camera has an APS-C size sensor, or otherwise known as a crop sensor. What that means is the sensor is smaller than a 35mm full-frame sensor that you'll find in the 6D Mark II and the EOS R5. This enables the camera to be much smaller and the lenses to be smaller too. An APS-C size sensor will give you an effective crop of 1.6 times the focal length of your lens. What that means is if you're using the same 100mm lens on a full-frame camera and on an APS-C size camera, what you're going to get is 160mm effective focal length. So it looks a bit more zoomed in. Now this could be a great advantage if you're using long lenses to photograph wildlife. For example, if you're using 100 to 400 on a 5D Mark IV, it will look like a 400mm. On an APS-C size sensor, it will look like a 560mm lens. So it's like having, wait, is it 560mm? I have to check my maths here. 640mm lens. I really need to learn to do some maths. I don't number good. So let's try that again. A 400mm lens on a 5D Mark IV will look like a 400mm lens, which is pretty zoomed in, is great for a lot of things. But if you want a little bit more reach, you could put on an APS-C size sensor and then you'll effectively be getting 640mm. Similarly though, if you want to go for wide angle shots and you're doing landscape for example, you're going to need an extra wide lens to compensate for that crop. So a 10mm lens becomes suddenly a 16mm lens. So you can see, to get an effective longer focal length, it is cheaper to do so on an APS-C size sensor. If you haven't tried using video yet, it's really worth trying on these cameras because the slow-mo makes it so easy. It takes away any of the handshake, you just slow the speed right down and everything looks professional. It means even I can get away with making some video. Talking of speed, that is what this camera is particularly good at. Shooting stills, you can get 14 frames a second with full autofocus, and even go up to 30 frames a second if you use the raw burst feature. The raw burst feature does crop the image a little bit, so you're going to be using 75 by 75% of the sensor, which means you'll get an 18 megapixel image at the end of it, or 30 18 megapixel images at the end of every second. Like nearly all of the cameras on the Canon range, the M6 does have Wi-Fi, but it also has Bluetooth, which means it's compatible with Bluetooth remote on your phone and the Bluetooth remote trigger that we sell separately. So particularly if you're doing some self-shooting or vlogging, you can flip the screen right up so it can see yourself, and use the Bluetooth remote to start the video. A couple of my other favourite features from this camera are the ability to do time lapses. You have two options for time lapses in this camera. If you'd like to do full resolution still images as an interval timer, it has that built in. So you can set how many shots to take and how long to leave in between each shot, and the camera will run through it on its own. The other option is to set up a time-lapse movie. To get into that mode, you will need to put the camera into movie mode first and then hit the menu button. In this mode, you simply set the interval between the images and how many images you want to take. The camera will then automatically work out for you how long it'll take to record the video and how long the resulting video will be. You then set up the first shot and let the camera run through the time-lapse, and at the end it compiles it all together and creates a video file for you. I personally prefer this as it's a lot less effort than taking a lot of still images and then editing them on the computer afterwards. One other feature that's in this camera that will be very useful for the next video I'll be making is focus bracketing. Focus bracketing allows the camera to automatically run through taking pictures at different focus distances. These images you can then compile yourself to do a focus stack. This is particularly useful for doing some macro work, so we'll be doing that in the next video. The last thing to say about the M6 is that it uses Canon's unique dual pixel autofocus technology. I'll talk a little bit more about this when I go through the R5, but most importantly, this focusing system is incredibly accurate both for stills and video. There is also an adapter available to allow you to use EF and EFS lenses on the EFM mount. So if you have existing DSLR lenses, you can use them on the M6 Mark II. I'll go into lenses in a little while, but the M6 paired with some of the smaller lenses makes for an excellent travel companion. My personal favourite is the 32mm 1.4. The M6 Mark II then offers amazing performance in a very small compact body. It makes a great companion if you've got an existing full-frame digital SLR and you want something smaller to travel with, but it also makes a stunning upgrade from many crop sensor digital SLRs, or if you're coming up from a compact camera. It's a great camera for doing video. I do a lot of these videos using the M6. It makes for an excellent still camera as well. With all that speed, it'll keep up with sports and wildlife, but also gives you all the detail and image quality you'd expect from a camera for doing landscapes and portraits. The next camera I'm going to talk about is this, the 6D Mark II. The 6D Mark II is Canon's best value full-frame digital SLR and offers a marked upgrade from the 6D Mark I. Most notably, the focusing system has been greatly improved. The 6D Mark II has an excellent 26.2 megapixel full-frame sensor. Now, we spoke a little bit on the M6 Mark II why a crop sensor camera has some advantage over full frame. But why would you want to go full frame? With a full frame sensor, the individual pixels are larger. So a 30 megapixel sensor on a crop sensor has very tiny individual pixels, but they're much larger on a full frame. Because those pixels are larger, they're able to gather more light, and the larger the sensor, the more surface area there is, which means low light performance will be improved. Image quality will also be improved thanks to a lot more flexibility with lens design on a full frame sensor. There are other improvements as well. Generally, you will see a better dynamic range on a full frame. Dynamic range is the amount of information from shadows to highlights that the camera can capture in a single image. The greater that amount of detail, the less likely you are to burn out highlights because they're slightly too bright or lose detail in the shadows. Another factor to consider is depth of field. Your perceived depth of field is shallower on a full frame sensor. So for example, if you're a portrait photographer and you want that blurry background, you're going to be able to get that a lot easier on a full frame sensor than you will on a crop. The 6D Mark II also has two independent focusing systems. When you're in live view and the mirror is flipped up, you're using the same dual pixel autofocus system that you'll find in any of our mirrorless bodies. But when the mirror is down and you're shooting through the viewfinder, you're using a 45-point all-cross type focusing system. When shopping for digital SLRs, the number of autofocus points it has is quite an important factor. The more autofocus points, the better it will be at tracking a moving subject. Just to make it a little bit more confusing, Not all focus points are created equal. You get cross-type points and non-cross-type points. Non-cross-type points either refer vertically or horizontally, but cross-type points refer both horizontally and vertically. So you get twice the capabilities in one spot. This makes it much easier for cross-type points to find focus, particularly on moving subjects. On the 6D Mark II, you're getting 45 all cross-type points. On the 6D Mark I, for example, it was 11 points in total and only one was cross-type in the centre. This means that the 6D Mark II is considerably better for autofocus, particularly at tracking moving subjects across the frame, but also for just picking up accurate focus using one of the outer points. The 6D Mark II offers up full HD video recording as well as 6.5 frames per second stills shooting. Like the M6, it has built-in Wi-Fi and Bluetooth, but on the 6D it also has built-in GPS, so you can geotag your images. The camera will actually embed the location data for your image in the metadata of the imagery. That way, when you look at your images back on the computer, you can bring up a map and see where they were shot. This is an absolutely lovely feature for if you're traveling around the world and you want to remember where you were shooting, or if you're scouting out locations, you can geotag the images and make sure that you're able to find exactly the same spot again when you go back. The 6D Mark II also has a little trick up its sleeve in that it's able to record 4K time-lapse videos. Much like the M6 Mark II and the R5 and most of the Canon range, the 6D has a full touchscreen interface. This makes it much easier to get around the menus, touch the focus on your subject. So who is the 6D Mark II best suited for? It's not the fastest camera in the Canon range, and it doesn't offer up the 4K video capabilities of some of the others. But it is an excellent stills camera, particularly in low light. So if you're a wedding photographer, or a portrait photographer, or a landscape photographer, this camera may well be the best camera for you. It's also a great landscape camera and a great travel camera. If you're an experienced photographer and you need a second body, the 6D Mark II might be perfect. The last camera I'm going to show you is the EOS R5. The R5 is the latest and genuinely the greatest camera Canon have made in a long time, and serves as the flagship camera in that system. So firstly, let's take a look at the numbers. The R5 has a 45 megapixel sensor, can shoot 12 frames a second with a fully mechanical shutter, and 20 frames a second if you're using the electronic shutter, with full autofocus between shots. It can shoot 8K raw video, 4K video without crop, and have autofocus during all video recording modes. The R5 can even do 120 frames a second in 4K using the full width of the sensor, meaning you can get absolutely stunning slow motion 4K footage. It has a super high resolution 5.69 million dot electronic viewfinder. It is incredibly clear and has a really high refresh rate, so if you're tracking moving subjects, it is really natural and very fast and able to do so. The R5 is the first camera within the Canon range to incorporate in-camera image stabilization. The 5-axis stabilization system gives you up to 8 stops of IS. What this means is the sensor moves within the body to compensate for any vibrations or handshake, allowing you to get sharp images at much slower shutter speeds than you would have been in before. This means you can get images like the silky water at a waterfall without the use of a tripod. The other major feature of this camera is its autofocus system. The R5 has dual pixel AF2, which is the second iteration of the dual pixel AF system I was talking about before. To give you an idea of how dual pixel AF works, if you imagine on the sensor, and every individual pixel, there is a microlens covering it. Underneath that microlens, ordinarily there would be a single photodiode. With dual pixel, it's 2 photodiodes, giving you effectively a left and a right eye on under every pixel. Giving you a left and right eye means that you can measure distances, and by measuring distances you can focus accurately. So effectively you have 45 million pixels or 45 million focus points in the R5. Obviously that would be slightly problematic to work with, so they're grouped together. This technology is unique to Canon. How it's often done otherwise is to replace individual pixels with phase detection points and then use that in combination with a contrast-based autofocus system. The issue with contrast-based systems is that in low light there is a complete lack of contrast. With dual pixel AF we're able to focus in incredibly low light, -6 EV. For reference, -3 EV is moonlight, -4 EV is starlight, -5 EV is roughly the equivalent of the aurora borealis, and -6 EV takes the human eye about a minute to adjust to. Combine this with all that new processing power and the R5 is able to focus on both humans as well as animals and detect the faces and the eyes of those subjects. One thing I particularly like as a portrait photographer is this eye detection. In this camera it goes a little bit further in that if it can't detect an eye, it goes to the face, and then if it can't detect the face, it goes to the head, and then it even goes to the body if it can't detect the head. And it'll even pick out heads if the subject is turned away from the camera. That way I know it's not suddenly going to focus on the background, but it will continue to focus on the subject no matter what. This dual pixel AF technology can also help you when you're in manual focus. So if you switch the camera over to manual focus, you can use what's called focus peaking. Focus peaking brings up a coloured fringe around whatever's in focus in the image. You can adjust the level of focus peaking and you can adjust the colour so it's more visible to you. This idea isn't unique to Canon, but the focus guide is. The focus guide I find is much more accurate as well. With the focus guide, you can move the guide anywhere in the picture and it gives you an indicator as to whether you're front or back focusing. That way you know which way to turn the lens to achieve focus. This is particularly helpful if you want to achieve accurate pull focus effects in video. The camera has dual card slots, so you have SD card slot and a CF Express card slot. What this means is you can have JPEG to one and RAW to another. You could even have video on one and stills to another, or you can just have them as a backup of the other. There's a whole range of options for in-camera RAW editing as well. So if you've taken a picture and you need to get it out quickly, you can make adjustments to the image in camera, send it over to your phone and get it out to where it needs to be in a record time. Like the M6 Mark II, the R5 does have the time-lapse features and the interval timer, as well as the focus bracketing feature. It also has multiple exposures and Bluetooth and Wi-Fi. But as you'd expect, the Wi-Fi is a little bit more advanced. The Wi-Fi system on the R5 allows you to do FTP transfer and is also able to transfer a lot more data faster. So if you're a press or sports photographer, you're able to get your images to where they need to be very, very quickly. Another factor to consider is weather sealing. High-end bodies like the R5 are incredibly well weather sealed. They're designed to take a little bit of rain and take a beating out in harsh conditions. They have a high resistance to water and dust, so you need to factor this in if you're going to be shooting in harsh conditions. The R5 to me is the ultimate all-round camera. It's very fast with high frame rates, very high resolution with a 45 megapixel sensor, and incredibly good in low light. So for any type of photography, from landscape to wildlife, press photography and sports photography, as well as for video making, this is the ultimate tool to have in your kit bag. That'll do.
You didn't say portraits.
It's also really good for portraits. I can't believe I missed that. I'm a portrait photographer. But it's brilliant at portrait photography. There's lots of other things to talk about with the R5, but I could go on forever. It's an excellent camera. One thing I particularly like about the Canon range is that the menu system stays very similar across the entire range. So if you come in with an entry-level camera, you can very easily pick up a high-end camera and still find your way around the menus. And for the most common settings you need access to, there's always the quick menu under the Q button. This differs slightly across mirrorless bodies and DSLRs. Depending on how you have the camera set up, there are two versions of this Q menu. If you're on a mirrorless body, you can access this Q menu by using the info button till it appears on the back screen. Then you just press the Q button and change whatever you want to change. This is the default Q screen for digital SLRs anyway, so it's much easier to find on those. If you're in live view on a DSLR or you're using a mirrorless body, this is the default Q menu. So you hit the Q button and you get the options run up the sides. A particularly useful area to access from here is the custom controls. You can hit the Q button and move across to customize controls to very quickly change your setup, and have a look in here because there's lots to change. Too much to go through in this video, but you can really set the camera up to work better and more efficiently for yourself by going through this menu. But I have, unfortunately, just noticed that customize is spelled with a Z here and not an S, and we're not in America, so I'm slightly disappointed, frankly. Now we've talked about cameras, it's time to talk about lenses. There's a lot of options with lenses, so I'm going to break it down into some small groups and explain what everything is so you know what to look for when you're shopping for them. Broadly speaking, you have lots of different lenses for different purposes. So you have wide-angle lenses that you might use for landscapes. You've got telephoto lenses that you might use for sports and wildlife. Standard zoom lenses for your general use and travel. Fixed focal length lenses or prime lenses that can be used for a wide variety of photography. Macro lenses for close-up work. And some other specialist lenses that we won't get into in this video. On a full-frame camera, 50mm is roughly the equivalent of what your eye sees. So anything wider or with a lower focal length than 50mm is considered a wide-angle lens. Anything higher is considered telephoto. We did talk about crop factor before, where shooting on an APS-C size sensor gives you 1.6 times your focal length. So roughly what your eye sees on an APS-C size sensor is around 35mm. In the Canon range we have effectively 4 lens ranges. So we have the EF-M lens range, which is designed for the mirrorless small M line. We have the RF line, which is designed for the R cameras. And we have the EF range, which is designed for digital SLRs. We also have EFS, which is designed for crop sensor digital SLRs. The EFS lenses cannot be used on full-frame digital SLRs, but the EF lenses can be used on crop sensor digital SLRs. You also may notice that for any focal length, there are 3 different versions of each lens, particularly within the EF line. So for a 50mm, for example, we have a 51.8, a 51.4, and a 51.2. At wildly varying different price points. So what do you get for your money? A bigger aperture or small f number means there's more glass in the lens, you're getting more light into the sensor, and therefore the lens is going to be slightly more expensive. The same holds true for zoom lenses. We have a 70-200 2.8 and a 70-200 f4. The f4 is roughly half the price of the 2.8. It's also roughly half the weight of the 2.8 as well. On zoom lenses, you may see your aperture displayed in slightly different ways. For example, on the 100-400, it's 100-400 f4.5 to 5.6. This is because as you zoom in, the maximum f number changes. Whereas on the 70-200 2.8, no matter where you are in the zoom, you can always reach a 2.8 aperture. Build quality is also a major factor for price. Within Canon's L range, which is Canon's Pro range of lenses, you're getting a much better build quality. These lenses are designed to take a bit of a beating. They can also go out in the rain a little bit because they're fully weather sealed. And they're designed to be a workhorse for working professionals. Image quality is also generally much better, thanks to better lens coatings and better lens elements as well. If you're a portrait photographer, you might be better suited to using prime lenses. It can be cheaper to get better image quality and a bigger aperture with a prime lens than it can be for a zoom lens. The EF-85 1.8 is an incredibly good value portrait lens. Most of my own work is shot on a 51.4 or, when I can get it, the 51.2 RF, which is by far and away my favourite lens. When looking at standard zoom ranges for your camera, something like a 24-70 or a 24-105, you have a bit of a trade-off. You could either go for a 24-70 2.8, so you get more light, or a 24-105, you get more focal length, but less light. Some lenses are also equipped with image stabilization, or IS. This can really help with reducing vibrations and minimizing the amount of handshake that you get come up in the image. Canon's L range come with lens hoods. Lens hoods greatly reduce the amount of lens flare you get in the images. Lens flare can be caused by the sun or other artificial light sources and can greatly reduce the amount of contrast in your images. The longer white lenses will often have tripod collars. This is for mounting on a tripod to distribute the weight a little bit more evenly so the camera isn't really front heavy. Longer lenses often have more switches on the side. So in this example, on the 70-200 or the 100-400, the first switch is a focus limiter. This limits the distance range that the focusing will use. That way, if you know a subject is 2.5 meters or further away, you could put it on 2.5 to infinity. But if your subject is closer than that, you'd put it on 1.2 to infinity. This way, if the camera loses focus, you're not hunting through the entire focus range. Simply turns off autofocus and puts the camera onto manual focus. And the last switches are often for the stabilizer. The image stabilizer to turn on or off, and then the mode for the stabilizer. Mode 1 is simply always on. Mode 2 locks the stabilizer on the horizontal axis, because if you're panning with a subject and tracking it across a scene, the movement of the camera can throw the stabilizer off. Some of the newer longer lenses have a mode 3 for the stabilizer. Mode 3 is turning the stabilizer off until you hit the shutter button. Some people just find this a little bit more comfortable to look through the viewfinder, but it also saves power because the stabilizer isn't on all the time. As you go towards the wide angle, you're likely to introduce more distortion. This is why very high quality wide angle lenses become quite expensive. You can see here that generally the RF lenses are slightly smaller than the EF lenses. For example, the 70-200 2.8 is considerably smaller in the RF version. However, the 85 equivalent is much larger, so it doesn't always hold true. One thing that definitely does seem to be true, however, is that like for like, the RF series gives you much better image quality. To give you an example of how focal length affects your images, I'm going to go out and photograph jade from 16mm all the way up to 400mm. I have to apologise, it was so windy that the microphone simply picked up the wind and you could barely hear what I was saying. So none of the audio from this day was useful. I'm starting off with the 16-35 2.8L EF lens adapted over to the R5. I'll be doing all of the images on the R5, so it's a fair test. You can see at 16mm it's created a lot of distortion and jade looks quite goofy. With jade standing a little bit further away but still at 16mm, we get an image that shows quite a lot of the surrounding area, which might be good if you're in a large landscape, but it can make for a busy image with nothing to particularly draw the eye. At 35mm, we've already greatly reduced the amount of the sides of the path that we're getting in the image. We've also greatly reduced the amount of distortion. Moving up to the 24-105, this image is at 50mm. Remember that 50mm is roughly what the eye sees, so this is quite a natural looking image. Now I've asked Jade to move further away and we're shooting at 85mm. This is a classic portrait look and is very flattering on the face, but then we don't get too much distracting scenery. Now we're at 100mm and the image is definitely more about jade than it is the scenery. I've not really done this before, but I'm now using 100-400 for portraiture, and we'll start off at 200mm. At this point the background compression looks fantastic, and ordinarily in a quiet location you might even still be able to communicate with your model. In this place, even at 85mm, it was so windy Jade couldn't hear what I was saying. At 400mm, the image looks great, but I am literally reduced to sign language, or vaguely waving my arms around. So this is not really practical for a portrait situation. In these images, I'm using the 85 1.2, and I'm going to show you the effects of aperture. All of these images are shot at the same distance. The first one at f16, then at f11, then at f2, and then at f1.2. You can see how much more separation we get between the background and the subject, drawing the eye into Jade. But aperture isn't the only thing that affects depth of field. These images are all shot at 85mm at 1.2. But as Jade gets closer, the background gets blurrier and blurrier. So it's not always necessary to go for a very big aperture to get a shallow depth of field. Your focal length and your distance to the subject makes a big difference. I'm going to leave you with a slideshow of images so that you can ask me anything you like in the live chat. Thank you so much for watching. I hope that's been helpful in guiding you through the Canon range. The next video will be all about macro. We'll go through the lenses that I didn't talk about in this video, and I'll show you some techniques on how to use them. Thank you so much for watching. Stay safe. Goodbye.